Well, here's a Royal Enfield 250 Crusader type engine, and this has been brought here. The owner tells me that there's an oil leak from the head gasket area and also an oil leak from the gearbox sprocket area. Now unfortunately, if it's a leak from the gearbox itself coming through behind the gearbox sprocket, on these machines that means that you've got to strip and remove the entire primary drive side and gearbox internals to get at the seal if it needs replacing. So although the crankcases don't actually have to be split, let's see if we can slew this round, all this lot here has got to come away. It might possibly have a split link in the primary chain. I'll have a look for that just in case, because if it has, that'll make the job a lot easier and mean I can leave this lot alone. But if not, the camshaft sprocket and the crankshaft sprocket, all that lot, and the engine sprocket will all have to come off, as well as the entire clutch. And then there's a little round plate bolted in behind the clutch into this casing, which can be unscrewed and moved away, and you can get access to the gearbox sprocket. But unfortunately, when you get the gearbox sprocket off, that's not good enough, because the seal's got to come out from this side of the engine, which means that even the sleeve gear that the gearbox sprocket fastens to, the whole lot, even that has to come out, and then you've got the bearing, and then finally you've got the seal. So not somebody's best idea the way that that was designed, but there you go. It's a complete primary drive and gearbox strip, including removing the gearbox main bearing if you want to change that seal. So it's a good idea if and when you're changing gearbox sprockets to be very careful not to damage the seal behind it, because that leaves you with a very big job to do. Well, I've literally just made a start on this Royal Enfield 250 engine, stripping what I need to get out the way off to access the leaky gearbox seal, if that is indeed what we've got. And I've already spotted something I'd rather not see, and that's the end feed for the crank there. The oil end feed has obviously had a good beating with a hammer on its end at some time and is belled over, and there's a nick in it there as well. So I think these can be removed from the cranks actually and be replaced, if I remember right. It's a while since I've done one of these engines, but I think they come out. Hopefully it will, and we can get a new one in there. I've already seen that the seal in the outer primary cover that interacts with this is very badly out of shape and damaged, so it'll be getting a new one of those as well. But I've seen this kind of thing on some Triumph Twins as well, where the end feed to the crank gets walloped, presumably when they're trying to drive a crank out through the main bearings, or in the case of this here, perhaps to shock it to get this sprocket off. But it really isn't the way at all, and it can cause a lot of other damage and compromise the oil feed to the crank and the big end, so it's really not a good idea to hit that with anything at all. You can screw the nut back onto the thread part way and perhaps use a suitable tube or something against that if you need to shock it for any reason, but you really don't want to be hitting the end of that at all, because it's very easy to damage, and it can cause a lot more damage afterwards and quickly ruin an engine if you're not very lucky. So that's a no-no really. Well, I haven't disconnected the primary drive, the clutch and the gearbox from the engine, the crankshaft itself yet, as we can see around here, hopefully. And the reason for that is I want to undo this gearbox main shaft nut, and sometimes they can be rather tight to get started. So at least this way, if I need to, I can probably put a spanner on the end of the crank on that nut or something to hold the engine in position and stop things turning while I get some weight on this to undo it, because with the primary drive disconnected, then you're at the mercy of being able to jam the gearbox sprocket with something with the gearbox in gear in order to create any resistance to get that undone. So I'm going to do that next, get this undone, and then I'll strip the primary drive down. Then I'll come back to this side and remove the gearbox end cover and get the guts of the gearbox out. Well, I'm nearly ready to remove the last few components of the primary drive, and I thought that the engine sprocket might slide off, but it won't, so I'm going to have to put a puller on that to get it off. But what I have noticed is there's the crank oil feed quill that came out. That was only finger tight actually. That came out no problem at all, so we can get a new one of those and fit it in there. I'm assuming and hoping that the bottom end of the engine and everything's okay. The guy who owns it said that all that was checked over, I think, and rebuilt, but I've only really been asked to deal with the leak from the gearbox or the primary case, whichever it is when we get to it, the seal. But in dismantling the primary drive and getting things out the way that I need out the way, I found that between the engine sprocket and the timing sprocket, there is supposed to be a thing called an engine retaining washer, which is like a special very thick shaped washer which sort of fits between the two. When you fit the engine sprocket and tighten the nut up, the engine sprocket washer clamps against the engine sprocket and pulls the crank through the main bearing tightly and clamps the engine sprocket to it. But in the case of this engine, that was missing completely. So on top of that, when I removed the timing chain tensioner, that came away in 2 pieces, so we'll need another one of those. It's quite easy to break their backs actually if you haven't got your spacers arranged perfectly, or say if you get a washer behind one hole in a tensioner accidentally and not the other, and you tighten the nuts up, you'll snap it. So that's another thing to look out for. And I've removed the nut from the nut and the thrower, oil thrower ring from the other end of the gearbox main shaft, and I mentioned keeping the primary drive connected up until that's done in order to sort of have any resistance you might need from the engine, and maybe use the nut on the other end of the crankshaft to hold a spanner on to hold the engine still. And as you can see, that's gone now. But I didn't mention when I was talking about it earlier that that nut actually has a left-hand thread, so that undoes the way you'd normally tighten something, so that's worth bearing in mind. So the next thing I'm going to do is hopefully get this clutch centre nut undone. I can get the clutch basket, primary chain and engine sprocket away next as well. I just need to put a puller on here to get that sprocket out the way, and then get hold of the clutch centre with something to hold it still, and then undo the nut in the centre. That will come off. Then we can get into the recess behind it and undo the nut on the gearbox sprocket. Then it'll be time to turn the engine round and just get all the guts out the gearbox and see what we're up against. Okay, I've now got access to all the potential causes of oil leaks from the primary drive and gearbox areas, and we'll start off with this plate that fits behind the clutch. Now usually there's a gasket around there, but all we've got is some scraggy remnants of an old gasket and some silicone rubber snot, and pretty much the same sort of thing on the corresponding face of the inspection cover, including a nice thick layer of rust over much of the surface area. So quite a lot of leakage might have come past that, and from the primary chain case at the back of the clutch and past this and into this area here. But I'm checking everything, and here's the gearbox sprocket nut, which obviously I've removed from there, and I've got it in, it fits through the back of this plate, and it's got a shoulder on it to engage with the seal that runs in this plate, and that seal is fine. Look at the resistance on that. The shoulder of the nut is a good snug fit inside that seal, so I know that's not the culprit. So what I'll do is I'll clean this up and get the proper gasket, and I'll also use a little bit of well seal or something on it just as a bit of insurance, and that will assure me then that no oil is coming out from the primary side into the sprocket area. But look at this. This gearbox sprocket doesn't really seem to be running in any sort of seal that I can see. Now either there isn't one in there, or it's so badly worn that it's sort of receded away from the area where we should sort of see evidence of it, and also the gearbox sprocket just sort of slips on all the way with no resistance at all right up to the shoulder of the inner race of the gearbox main bearing. So I suspect there's either no oil seal in there or a very, very worn one. So it's a gearbox strip, and get all the guts out, including that bearing, and then between the bearing and this area of the casing, that is where the oil seal or an oil seal ought to live, and really should sort of be prominent enough then, if you like, to sort of grip. You can actually see the shiny area on the shoulder of the gearbox sprocket, so maybe it has just been touching something. I can't really see if there's anything there, but I'd expect a little more resistance sliding it home all the way than what we've got there, and I don't think, if there is a seal there, that's not working and it needs to be replaced. So we'll be out with the gearbox next, but first a bit of lunch.